Welcome to the History Maps podcast. Think about trying to govern a territory that stretches from the frozen cliffs of northern Canada all the way down the continent.
Right, down through dense forests and complex river networks, basically terminating in the humid swamps of the Gulf of Mexico.
Exactly. And now, try to maintain that vast geographic footprint using a population that could barely fill a contemporary college football stadium.
It is quite the logistical puzzle. So today, our mission is to unpack a really complex subject. We are doing a comprehensive deep dive into New France as part of our North America series.
Right, so we are looking at an empire that spanned from 1534 to 1763. We need to figure out how, a scattered string of precarious fur trading outposts evolved into a continental society.
And ultimately why that entire apparatus collapsed. To do that, we are drawing from a very specific set of sources, primarily original colonial records, early census data collected by the administrators of the time, and rigorous historiographical analysis.
Because if you live in North America today, the ghosts of New France are still baked into the infrastructure around you.
Yeah, the decisions made by French administrators and, well, the paths forged by independent traders actively dictate the cultural boundaries and the legal systems you still see today.
Not to mention the literal placement of cities on a modern map. So, we are inviting you to examine the raw materials of history with us.
Let us begin by looking at the blueprint of this territory. The geographical scope is staggering, but when you read the records, it is clear the earliest European attempts to claim this land were not born from some grand master plan.
Right, they weren't trying to settle a new world at first.
No, the initial drive was strictly navigational. The French crown, like many European powers in the 16th century, was feeling squeezed.
Because the Ottoman Empire dominated the eastern overland trade routes.
Exactly. And the Spanish and Portuguese were busy locking down the southern maritime routes. So the French king, Francis I, needed an alternative.
Which brings us to 1523.
Right. He commissions a Florentine navigator named Giovanni da Verrazzano. The objective was purely economic and highly specific. They wanted to find a western sea passage that cut straight through this inconvenient landmass.
To reach Cathay, which we know today as China.
Yes. So late that year, Verrazzano departs from Dieppe with 50 men on a small caravel. By the early months of 1524, he finds himself anchored in the narrows of what is now New York Bay.
Which he actually named Nouvelle Angoulême, in honor of the king's former title. It always shifts my perspective to consider New York Bay initially bearing a French royal designation.
It is striking detail, but, Verrazzano was mapping the coastline, not finding a route through it. He was charting the boundaries.
He coined the names Francesca and Nova Gallia, right?
Yes, to describe that seemingly endless coastline stretching between the known Spanish territory in Mexico and the English claims up in Newfoundland.
He didn't find a passage to Asia, but his voyage convinced the French crown that this newly documented land possessed strategic value.
And that leads us straight to Jacques Cartier. In 1534, Cartier sails into the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
He steps onto the Gaspé Peninsula, erects a wooden cross, and formally claims the land for King Francis I.
Which is often marked as the inception of New France. But erecting a cross on a summer day is performative. Actually attempting to carve out an existence there proved to be a lethal undertaking.
The early records really are just a chronicle of sequential disasters.
Absolutely. The French initiated their first major settlement attempt in 1541 with Fort Charlesbourg Royal near present-day Quebec City. The Crown intended it to be a robust colony of 400 people.
But the reality of the North American winter set in.
That, combined with deteriorating relations with the local Iroquoian peoples, just fractured the settlement. It was abandoned after merely 2 years.
And then, decades later, in 1598, they tried a different strategy. They placed a trading post on Sable Island, which is this desolate sandbar off the coast of Acadia.
And that isolated venture failed completely. Then in 1600, they tried again at Tadoussac, where the Saguenay River meets the St. Lawrence. Of the personnel left to hold the post, only 5 survived the winter.
I have to stop you there, because the logic breaks down for me. We are talking about repeated catastrophic failures. Men are freezing, starving, and succumbing to disease on a barren coast.
Yeah, it was brutal.
So why would the French administration or private merchants continue to finance expeditions to a place that seemingly offered nothing but death?
The motivation pivots entirely on a shift in market demand back in Europe. While the grand state-sponsored colonies were failing, French fishermen had been quietly and profitably sailing to the Atlantic coast for decades to harvest cod.
And during those seasonal fishing trips, they began trading with First Nations peoples.
Right. The merchants reviewing the logs realized this territory was not just an icy obstacle blocking the route to Asia, it was a repository of raw materials. Specifically, they were looking at the beaver.
Because the beaver population in Europe had been hunted to near extinction by this point.
That is the crucial economic catalyst. The European fashion market developed an insatiable demand for felt hats, and the barbed undercoat of the North American beaver produced the highest quality felt available.
So this single consumer trend forced the Crown to alter its strategy.
Exactly. They could no longer just explore. They had to colonize and secure the river networks to protect that lucrative fur supply chain from European rivals.
So they adjust their approach, and they finally managed to establish a foothold that lasts. In 1605, King Henry IV grants a monopoly to Pierre Duguay, Sieur de Monts.
Accompanied by figures like Samuel de Champlain and Jean de Biencourt de Poutrincourt, they established Port Royal in Acadia, which is modern-day Nova Scotia.
And the sources detail an immediate, concerted effort to transplant European societal structures into this environment.
Poutrincourt receives the first seigneury, a formal feudal land grant in New France. He brings over an apothecary named Louis Hébert, who transitions into becoming the first European to establish sustained agricultural practices in northern North America.
The records show Hébert experimenting with viticulture, arboriculture, and cereal farming. They even managed to construct a functioning grist mill by 1607.
But the true geographical anchor is dropped a year later. In 1608, Champlain pushes further inland, up the St. Lawrence, and founds Quebec City.
Though we need to be careful with the word city. He initiated this settlement with merely 28 men.
Right, and the vignette of that first winter is harrowing. The settlement was decimated by severe weather and disease, predominantly scurvy.
The men lacked the necessary vitamin C, and their bodies simply began to fail.
To grasp the fragility of this endeavor, just look at the population data. By 1630, over 2 decades after its founding, the settlement of Quebec contained only 103 colonists.
A full century of European ambition, immense financial investment, and the result is roughly 100 people clinging to a cliff above the St. Lawrence River.
It is a precarious start.
Having established that these permanent settlements were incredibly fragile, we must examine the economic engine that kept them functioning at all. This leads us into what historians call the Staples thesis.
Yes, the Staples thesis.
Can you unpack the mechanics of that theory for us?
Well, it is a foundational economic theory used to explain the development of Canada. It argues that the economic, political, and social development of New France was dictated almost entirely by the extraction and export of a single, unprocessed commodity.
A staple good.
Exactly. Initially, that staple was cod from the Atlantic. But as the French presence moved into the continental interior throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, the entire colonial apparatus reorganized itself around the North American fur trade.
With Montreal evolving into the absolute centralized hub of this extraction network.
That is right.
I look at the Staples thesis sort of like a modern town whose entire existence relies on a single, highly lucrative technology campus.
Oh, that is a very apt comparison.
Right, because that campus brings in substantial capital, and it puts the town on the global map. But it severely handicaps every other complementary sector in the local economy.
Because all the labor and investment flows into that one specific industry.
Exactly. Nobody's investing in local agriculture, manufacturing, or secondary businesses. In New France, because fur was a commodity of minimal bulk but exceptionally high value, it monopolized the economic focus.
And you see that reflected in the agricultural sector around Montreal, which remained largely stagnant and subsistence-oriented.
The farmers were not producing food for export. They were merely trying to feed the colony while the primary energy went toward acquiring pelts.
That analogy tracks perfectly with the historical record. The Crown outsourced the management of this economy to private entities. The Company of New France was granted commercial rights to gather and export furs in 1627.
They dictated the price points, defended their monopoly, and governed the singular economy.
But the actual physical logistics of acquiring those furs across thousands of miles of wilderness required a highly specific labor force. This demand created the phenomenon of the coureurs des bois, the runners of the woods.
These are the individuals who essentially drop off the colonial grid.
Pretty much. They functioned outside the established legal framework. The coureurs des bois were independent, unlicensed French traders. They paddled deep into the continental interior, living directly among indigenous nations to secure furs at the source,
And by doing this, they bypassed the company monopolies and evaded colonial taxation.
which caused deep anxiety among the administrators in Montreal and the royal court in Paris. The authorities viewed them as a destabilizing force.
There was a prevailing fear that these men were debauching the French character by abandoning European societal norms.
And simultaneously destabilizing indigenous communities, primarily through the introduction of alcohol as a trade good.
Yes, the alcohol trade is a highly contentious element in the sources. The colonial government and the religious authorities frequently attempted to ban the transport of spirits into the interior.
But the bans were perpetually ineffective.
The trade dynamics remained heavily dependent on it, because if the French refused to trade alcohol, the indigenous traders would simply take their furs to the English or Dutch, who had no such restrictions.
Over time, the administration attempted to regain control by replacing the independent coureurs des bois with voyageurs.
Men who undertook the same grueling river journeys, but were officially licensed, taxed, and worked directly for established merchant outfits.
Right, but beneath the bureaucratic struggles over licensing and monopolies lies a fundamental truth of New France: the absolute reliance on indigenous peoples.
The French settlers possessed steel tools and firearms, but they were fundamentally uncooked to survive the environmental realities of the continent.
Indigenous nations taught the French the necessary mechanics of survival. They taught them how to navigate the complex river systems using birch bark canoes,
How to hunt and forage during the winter months, and how to utilize animal hides for clothing to prevent exposure.
and the relationship moved far beyond mere transactional commerce. It became deeply interwoven at a cultural level. French trappers living far from the settlements frequently formed relationships with indigenous women.
For the Frenchmen, these unions provided essential physical protection, integration into kinship networks, and access to prime hunting grounds.
And for the indigenous communities, it secured a direct pipeline to European trade goods. Out of these unions, a distinct cultural group emerged: the Métis people.
The term métis derives from an old French word denoting a person of mixed parentage.
In the early phases of colonization, the French colonial authorities actively encouraged these intermarriages,
Right. The official policy viewed intermarriage as a mechanism for assimilation.
hoping to absorb First Nations into the French cultural and religious sphere, thereby cementing military and trade alliances.
However, as the decades progressed and the Métis began to coalesce into their own distinct, independent culture with unique social structures, the French administration reversed its policy.
They actively discouraged the practice, fearing a loss of control over the frontier population.
But by the time the administration changed its mind, those indigenous alliances were already forged, and they were the only thing keeping the colony alive.
Because New France did not exist in a vacuum, it was surrounded by intense, brutal competition.
We have to examine a specific event in 1609 because Champlain made a tactical decision that dictated the geopolitical reality of the region for the next century.
That event is pivotal. Champlain recognized that the survival of the French fur trade depended entirely on maintaining his alliances with the Algonquin, Montagnais, and Huron peoples.
To prove his value as an ally, he agreed to accompany them on a military expedition south toward Lake Champlain to engage their traditional enemies, the Iroquois Confederacy.
During the subsequent encounter, Champlain stepped forward with an arquebus and killed 2 Iroquois chiefs with his initial volley.
It is a profound inflection point. Champlain secures the loyalty of his trading partners, but that single volley ignites a century of relentless, grinding warfare known as the Beaver Wars.
The Iroquois, who soon established their own lucrative trade alliances with the Dutch and subsequently the English, embarked on a prolonged military campaign.
Their objective was to dismantle the French trade network, destroy the French allied indigenous nations, and divert the flow of interior furs southward down the Hudson River.
And the threat was not limited to indigenous rivals. The English Empire was actively maneuvering to choke off the French economic lifeblood from the north.
In 1670, King Charles II of England issued a royal charter creating the Hudson's Bay Company.
This charter granted the company a complete monopoly over the entire vast watershed that drained into Hudson Bay, effectively outflanking the French interior networks.
The historical irony here is profound. The English did not map that northern route on their own.
No, they certainly did not.
The creation of the Hudson's Bay Company was directly facilitated by 2 deeply frustrated French coureurs des bois, Pierre Esprit Radisson and Médard de Groseilliers.
They had successfully navigated the northern routes and brought back a fortune in furs. But upon returning to New France, the colonial authorities confiscated their furs and fined them for trading without a license.
Outraged by the bureaucracy, they took their geographical knowledge and their trade contacts straight to the English court.
That defection perfectly encapsulates the fragile, tenuous nature of the North American economy at the time. The private, company-led model of colonization was generating wealth for a select few shareholders in Europe.
But it left the actual physical colony of New France sparsely populated, economically stunted, and perilously vulnerable to the dual threats of Iroquois raids and English expansion.
The French crown observes this deteriorating situation and concludes that the private enterprise model has failed. By the mid-17th century, it becomes obvious that without direct state intervention, the entire colonial project will collapse.
So in 1663, King Louis XIV takes decisive action. He officially revokes the charter of the Company of 100 Associates and elevates New France to the status of a royal province.
The administration of the colony is placed directly under the jurisdiction of the French Minister of the Marine.
And to address the immediate existential threat posed by the Iroquois, the king dispatches a professional standing military force, the Carignan-Salieres Regiment.
Sending a regiment provides security, but, to manage a province, you need precise data. The crown sends Jean Talon to serve as the first intendant of New France.
The intendant was essentially the chief administrative officer, responsible for finance, policing, and justice.
And Talon undertakes a monumental bureaucratic task. Between 1665 and 1666, he conducts a comprehensive census. This stands as the first organized census conducted in North America.
The data extracted from Talon's census starkly illuminated the colony's structural weakness.
He recorded a total population of 3,215 individuals of European descent, categorized into 538 families.
But the true crisis was revealed in the demographics. The census counted 2,034 men and merely 1,181 women.
A society operating with that severe of a gender imbalance cannot sustain organic demographic growth.
The men are dispersed in the fur trade, and there are simply not enough women to establish stable, multi-generational families.
To solve this, the Crown initiates one of the most aggressive demographic engineering projects in colonial history. They implement the program of the King's Daughters, or Les Filles du Roi.
The program ran from 1663 to 1673, right?
Yes. The French government directly sponsored the transatlantic passage of approximately 800 unmarried women to New France.
These women, primarily aged between 15 and 30, were recruited from various backgrounds, including urban commoners and women from the Salpêtrière Hospital in Paris.
They were selected based on their physical health and moral standing. The king not only financed their voyage, but also provided them with a royal dowry.
Usually in the form of practical goods or currency, to facilitate their immediate marriage to the male settlers upon arrival.
And the intervention works. They inject 800 women into the population.
But if we trace the demographics forward, something extraordinary happens. By the early 1700s, the population of New France reaches around 15,000.
And by 1754, it expands to 55,000.
So how does the population multiply so rapidly when we know, from the records, that there was no subsequent wave of mass immigration from France? The numbers do not seem to align.
Well, the primary engine of that demographic explosion was a staggeringly high birth rate, fueled by specific environmental conditions.
Historical demographic analysis indicates that women in New France had roughly 30% more children than women living in metropolitan France during the same period.
A 30% increase in fertility requires a fundamental shift in daily life.
What were the specific mechanisms driving that increase?
It connects directly to nutrition and pathology. The inhabitants of New France enjoyed an exceptionally high-protein diet compared to the European peasantry.
There's a natural abundance of game, meat, and fish, and they had access to largely uncontaminated water sources.
They also developed highly effective methods for food preservation, ensuring adequate caloric intake during the severe winters.
Furthermore, the sprawling, low-density settlement patterns acted as a natural epidemiological barrier.
Exactly. The lethal infectious diseases that routinely culled the densely packed populations of European cities simply could not spread as rapidly or as destructively among the dispersed farmsteads of the St. Lawrence Valley.
It is a critical distinction. Better nutrition and natural quarantine conditions lead to lower infant mortality and larger families.
But we must ensure we do not reduce the women of New France merely to demographic statistics.
That is a vital point. The socioeconomic structure of New France required women to take on expansive roles.
Because the overarching economy was still tethered to the fur trade, many men were absent from the settlements for months or even years at a time.
Consequently, women actively managed the local economy. The legal records show women operating as merchants, managing supply chains, and running provision stores.
When husbands died, widows routinely assumed full control of complex business operations.
Several women emerged as independent entrepreneurs, managing the logistical networks that supplied the interior outposts, proving indispensable to the daily functioning of the colony.
Now, as the population expands from 3,000 to tens of thousands, stretching out along the banks of the St. Lawrence, the administrative infrastructure must evolve.
The informal, localized dispute resolution of a frontier outpost is no longer sufficient.
The Crown recognized the necessity of imposing a standardized system of law and social order. Prior to the royal takeover in 1663, the application of justice was fragmented and often arbitrary.
Legal disputes were generally resolved by the governor, who issued verdicts based on personal judgment or immediate political needs.
The Company of New France had attempted to formalize things by creating the role of the Great Seneschal, a Chief Justice position. But it functioned largely as an honorary title without a rigorous administrative apparatus supporting it.
It sounds like the transition from a frontier town run by a single sheriff's whims to a structured society with a formal Supreme Court and codified civil rights.
That is a fair way to conceptualize it.
You cannot effectively govern an expanding, complex agricultural and commercial society based on the daily moods of a single colonial governor.
The royal reforms addressed this directly. In 1663, the administration divided Canada into 3 distinct judicial districts: Quebec City, Trois-Rivières, and Montreal.
The Crown appointed a royal judge to preside over each district.
Above these regional courts, they established the Sovereign Council, later rebranded as the Superior Council. This body functioned as the highest appellate court in the colony, akin to a council of state, ensuring legal uniformity.
But establishing courts is only half the equation. What specific legal code were these judges actually enforcing?
Well, in 1664, the French crown formally decreed that the Custom of Paris, or the Coutume de Paris, would serve as the exclusive source of civil law for the colony.
This was an enormous standardization effort.
It meant that every complex matter regarding property ownership, the drafting of marriage contracts, the division of estates, and the rights of inheritance was governed by a single codified set of rules.
This standardization was crucial for regulating the seigneurial system, where land was divided into long, narrow strips extending back from the river,
ensuring equitable access to the primary transportation route.
But the imposition of royal law did encounter resistance from entrenched local powers. The island of Montreal serves as a prime example.
Yes, for years, the island functioned essentially as a private fiefdom managed by a religious order, the Society of Priests of St. Sulpice.
The Sulpicians held the seigneurial rights and administered their own localized system of justice. It required sustained, deliberate pressure from the royal administration before the Sulpicians finally relinquished their legal authority to the royal courts in 1666.
This tension between state administration and religious authority brings us to the other dominant pillar of control in New France, the Catholic Church.
The Catholic Church was not merely a spiritual institution, it was an active agent of state policy.
The founding charter of the Company of 100 Associates in 1627 contained an explicit directive. The colony must be exclusively Catholic.
The settlement of non-Catholics was strictly prohibited.
This exclusionary policy was later reinforced on a global scale when the French crown outlawed Protestantism across France and all its colonial holdings via the Edict of Fontainebleau in 1685.
Royal decrees, however, frequently failed to reflect the reality on the ground. Despite the strict prohibition and the threat of severe penalties, the census data and shipping logs revealed that approximately 15,000 Protestant Huguenots successfully integrated into the colony.
The presence of the Huguenots highlights the tension between religious ideology and economic necessity.
The Huguenots were a deeply mercantile demographic, largely originating from the bustling coastal port cities of France.
They managed to infiltrate the colony by utilizing various socioeconomic pretexts, often forging documents or quietly concealing their religious practices.
And the colonial officials often turned a blind eye initially, because the Huguenots possessed vast, highly efficient, and deeply interconnected maritime trading networks that span across Europe.
If these merchants were injecting capital and expanding trade networks, why did the royal administration ultimately perceive them as a critical threat?
The threat was geopolitical. The Huguenots conducted extensive trade with the Dutch Republic and the Kingdom of England.
Both of these nations were fiercely Protestant, and both were the primary imperial and military rivals of the French state.
The administrators in Quebec and Paris developed a pervasive fear that the Huguenots residing in New France would naturally sympathize with or provide intelligence to English Protestants operating in adjacent territories.
Over time, as imperial paranoia deepened, the authorities tightened their restrictions, ultimately declaring that known Protestants were only permitted to reside in the colony during the brief summer trading season and were strictly forbidden from wintering or establishing permanent residence.
While the administrators were policing the merchants in the urban centers, the religious orders, specifically the Jesuit missionaries, were pushing outward into the deep interior.
Their mandate was the spiritual conversion of indigenous nations, but they rapidly discovered that conversion required navigating complex existing social and economic structures.
The Jesuit strategy among the Huron people perfectly illustrates this dynamic.
The Jesuits understood that they could not simply arrive and demand compliance. They leveraged the French economic monopoly.
The French colonial authorities established a firm policy. If an indigenous nation wished to access French trade goods, they were required to accept the permanent presence of Jesuit missionaries within their communities.
For the Huron, accessing those trade goods was not a luxury. It was a societal imperative.
The necessity extended far beyond the practical acquisition of iron axes or muskets. The sources describe the Huron Feast of the Dead, an elaborate communal burial ceremony occurring every 10 to 15 years.
The ritual required substantial quantities of prestige goods to be buried alongside the ancestors. The European trade provided copper kettles, glass beads, and metal tools that were integrated into these spiritual practices.
Consequently, rejecting the Jesuit presence meant severing the supply line of goods necessary to appropriately honor the dead, a risk the Huron leadership was unwilling to take.
However, the prolonged integration of the Jesuits into indigenous societies generated profound cultural friction. This friction was most visible in the collision of gender norms.
The sources detail this conflict extensively. Numerous indigenous communities, including the Huron and the Iroquois, operated within matriarchal or matrilineal structures.
Women controlled the agricultural production, influenced the selection of leaders, and held substantial political and diplomatic power.
This societal structure deeply offended the Jesuit missionaries.
It was entirely incompatible with their worldview. The Jesuits were agents of a strictly patriarchal European society.
The missionary logs explicitly outline their frustration. One source articulates their objective clearly, stating that in the French tradition, women are expected to be completely obedient to their masters, meaning their husbands.
The Jesuits viewed the political autonomy of indigenous women as a barrier to conversion. They actively sought to dismantle the matriarchal systems, attempting to restructure the societal hierarchy to enforce European patriarchal obedience and female submissiveness.
The indigenous women were entirely aware of the societal restructuring the Jesuits were attempting.
They recognized that embracing the Catholic doctrine required actively surrendering their autonomy, their political voice, and their status within the community.
The sources note significant organized resistance from indigenous women who sought to marginalize the missionaries.
It is a clear demonstration of how colonial expansion involves the attempted erasure not just of physical borders, but of the internal foundational structures of a society.
Beyond the spiritual and social interventions, the religious institutions were also the primary providers of physical care.
The management of public health in New France was a monumental task, handled almost exclusively by Catholic congregations.
The colony established a network of small hospitals, designated as Hôtel Dieu, in the primary settlements of Montreal, Quebec City, and Trois-Rivières.
These facilities were managed by dedicated nursing sisters who worked in tandem with secular surgeons and apothecaries.
The medical challenges were severe. The ships arriving from Europe routinely imported devastating pathogens.
Epidemics of measles, typhoid, and smallpox frequently tore through the settlements. The mortality data shows years where a single outbreak could eradicate up to 8% of the colony's entire population.
Yet when historians analyze the comparative demographic data, a paradoxical reality emerges.
Despite these brutal, episodic outbreaks, and despite the fact that the settlements lacked paved roads and had livestock roaming freely, the baseline public health and life expectancy in New France was arguably superior to that of metropolitan France.
This connects directly to the environmental factors we discussed regarding the birth rate.
Precisely. Once you moved beyond the immediate, concentrated palisades of the three main towns, the sheer vastness of the geography diluted the population density.
The pathogens simply lack the crowded, unsanitary hosts required to sustain a prolonged epidemic, unlike the densely packed slums of Paris or London.
Furthermore, the Superior Council did not ignore public health. They implemented early, rudimentary urban sanitation regulations, legally mandating the construction of latrines, and enforcing rules regarding proper waste disposal to mitigate water contamination.
So as the northern settlements solidified their legal, medical, and religious infrastructure, the vanguard of the French Empire was already pushing the boundaries outward.
The strategy evolved from simply holding the St. Lawrence to seeking dominance over the entire continental interior. This ambition leads us to the southern expansion, the creation of La Louisiane.
The geopolitical strategy underlying Louisiana was elegant in its simplicity. Control the primary waterways, and you control the continent.
The French understood that the Mississippi River was the central artery of North America.
In 1682, the explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, successfully navigated the Ohio and Mississippi River valleys.
He journeyed the entire length of the river down to the Gulf of Mexico, formally claiming the massive watershed for King Louis XIV.
La Salle possessed grand strategic vision, but his logistical execution was deeply flawed.
Very flawed. In 1685, he returned with a fleet to establish a permanent colony at the mouth of the Mississippi.
However, hindered by wildly inaccurate contemporary maps and primitive navigational instruments, he overshot his target by hundreds of miles and made landfall in present-day Texas.
The Texas colony was a catastrophic failure. The settlers were decimated by disease, starvation, and eventually the fragile settlement was entirely destroyed by an attack from the local Karankawa population in 1688.
Despite the catastrophic failure of La Salle's Texas venture, the French administration remained committed to the Southern strategy.
Over the subsequent decades, they successfully planted settlements in the southern Illinois country, which became a vital agricultural breadbasket, and eventually founded the port city of New Orleans near the mouth of the Mississippi.
The economic foundation of this southern territory developed distinctly from the northern colonies.
While Quebec's economy was inextricably tethered to the beaver pelt, the initial commercial manifests out of Louisiana, beginning around 1705, show an economy heavily reliant on the export of deer and bear hides.
The demographic composition of Louisiana also diverged sharply from the northern model.
In the St. Lawrence Valley, the population was expanding organically through the high birth rates of the French settlers.
Louisiana, however, possessed a brutal subtropical climate that resulted in exceptionally high mortality rates among the early European colonists.
To replace the dying labor force and clear the land for plantations, the colonial administration turned to the transatlantic slave trade.
The demographic shift was rapid and profound. By the mid-1730s, the census records indicate a stark reality.
Enslaved African men, women, and children constituted approximately 65% of the roughly 6,000 non-indigenous inhabitants of Louisiana.
The institution of slavery became the central pillar of the Southern colonial economy.
And the overarching administration of Louisiana was characterized by constant financial instability. The territory was a substantial drain on the royal treasury.
Desperate to offload the financial burden, the French king transferred commercial control of Louisiana to a wealthy banker named Antoine Crozat in 1713.
Crozat poured a fortune into the colony, failed to generate a return, and surrendered his charter just a few years later.
Following Crozat in 1719, administrative control was handed to the Company of the Indies.
The Company of the Indies employed aggressive, often coercive tactics to populate the territory. They initiated large-scale propaganda campaigns across Europe to attract willing settlers.
When those efforts fell short, they collaborated with the French state to forcibly deport individuals.
They swept the streets of Paris, rounding up unemployed persons, convicted criminals, and marginalized citizens, forcing them onto ships bound for New Orleans.
The financial speculation surrounding the company eventually triggered a severe economic crash known as the Mississippi Bubble.
The company went bankrupt, and by 1720, control of Louisiana reverted directly to the French crown.
Let us zoom out and look at the map of New France at its peak in the early 18th century.
From the fortress of Quebec, stretching through the Great Lakes, down the entire length of the Mississippi River to New Orleans.
It is an empire of almost unimaginable geographic scale, but it is a hollow empire. It is constructed entirely on river routes and a sparse network of isolated wooden forts.
It was an empire built on mobility rather than density.
I conceptualize the geopolitical situation like a large corporate franchise battle. France was operating a remote extraction pipeline.
They held a vast territory, but only maintained enough personnel to extract the resources and ship them back to the headquarters in Europe.
Right next door, along the Atlantic coast, Great Britain was operating a retail franchise model. They were continually opening new, densely populated locations, building permanent infrastructure, and expanding their footprint westward.
The large territorial claims of the French pipeline inevitably collided with the expanding populations of the British franchise, making prolonged warfare an absolute certainty.
It is like visualizing New France as an incredibly vast fortress, but with walls that are much too thin, trying to hold off a rapidly multiplying neighbor.
The reality of constant military threat dictated the rhythm of daily life, particularly in outposts like Montreal.
Montreal was the staging ground for the Western fur trade fleets, making it the primary target for Iroquois military campaigns.
The Iroquois recognized that if they could sever the supply lines at Montreal, the entire French interior network would wither.
The sources provide a visceral vignette from 1660 that captures the sheer desperation of this period, the Battle of Long Sault.
Adam Dollard des Ormeaux, leading a small, hastily organized militia of just 16 Frenchmen from Montreal, traveled up the Ottawa River.
They were attempting to intercept an Iroquois hunting party, but instead they collided with a large Iroquois offensive force numbering in the hundreds.
The French barricaded themselves in an abandoned palisade. The siege lasted for days.
Ultimately, the French accidentally detonated a keg of gunpowder within their own defenses, leading to their complete annihilation. Not a single Frenchman survived.
However, their fierce, prolonged resistance is historically credited with disrupting the Iroquois offensive, causing them to abandon their planned assault on Montreal for that year.
That localized, intense frontier violence was the baseline of existence.
Over time, these skirmishes escalated and formalized into a series of intercolonial wars that served as proxy conflicts for the dynastic struggles tearing apart Europe.
Between the late 17th and mid-18th centuries, the continent suffered through King William's War, Queen Anne's War, Father Rail's War, King George's War, and Father Le Loutre's War.
In this landscape of continuous warfare, alliances dictated survival. The French recognized they lacked the manpower to defend their vast borders alone.
They formed a vital strategic alliance with the Wabanaki Confederacy.
This coalition of indigenous nations actively defended the highly contested borderlands of Acadia and present-day Maine, utilizing rapid raids and ambushes to halt the aggressive expansion of New England settlements.
It created a vicious generational cycle of raid and retribution.
Yet, despite the tactical brilliance of French commanders and the fierce effectiveness of their indigenous allies, the underlying structural flaw of New France could not be mitigated by military skill.
The conflict was ultimately determined by an inescapable demographic reality. The numbers clarify the inevitable outcome.
By 1760, at the absolute climax of the struggle for continental dominance, New France possessed a total population of approximately 70,000 inhabitants, achieved predominantly through the natural birth rate.
In stark contrast, the British 13 colonies boasted a population approaching 1.6 million people.
That represents a demographic ratio of roughly 23-1 in favor of the British.
This catastrophic disparity was not an accident. It was the direct, predictable result of the fundamentally opposed colonial philosophies we outlined earlier.
France viewed North America as a commercial hinterland. They prioritized the construction of strategic military forts to protect trade corridors, but they consistently refused to sponsor bulk civilian emigration, fearing it would depopulate the French countryside.
Great Britain, conversely, utilized their colonies as a pressure valve for their own societal transformations.
They aggressively promoted mass emigration, sending religious dissenters, impoverished laborers, and ambitious merchants to construct dense, self-sustaining agricultural and commercial societies.
You have a thinly populated extraction network attempting to contain a heavily populated, aggressively expanding settler society.
The immense demographic pressure generated by the British colonies, combined with continuous violent friction in highly contested regions like the Ohio River Valley, finally reached a breaking point.
It ignited the ultimate conflict, the North American theater of the Seven Years' War.
In the initial phases of the war, the French military apparatus was highly effective.
Despite facing overwhelming numerical disadvantages, French forces, under the command of tacticians like the Marquis de Montcalm, leveraged their extensive network of indigenous alliances.
They used their deep understanding of frontier warfare to secure a string of demoralizing victories against the British.
The French systematically captured vital British installations, including Fort Oswego and Fort William Henry, and inflicted a devastating tactical defeat upon a large British army at Fort Carillon in 1758.
But military brilliance can only delay mathematical certainty for so long. The tide eventually turns as the British mobilize their vast resources, and the nature of the warfare becomes absolute and total.
In the Eastern Theater of Acadia, the British administration decides they will no longer tolerate the presence of the French-speaking Catholic Acadian population.
Despite the fact that the territory had technically been under British jurisdiction for decades.
Commencing in 1755, the British military executes the Great Upheaval.
They systematically round up thousands of Acadians, confiscate their property, and forcibly expel them from their ancestral lands.
It was a brutal operation of mass deportation. The Acadians were loaded onto transport ships and dispersed.
Some were scattered across the hostile 13 colonies, others were shipped back to the slums of Europe, and many died of disease during the voyages.
As we traced earlier, a significant portion of those who survived the expulsion eventually migrated south, seeking refuge in the Spanish-controlled but culturally familiar territory of Louisiana, where their descendants evolved into the Cajun culture.
With the eastern flank secured, the British military apparatus pivots its full weight toward the absolute heart of New France.
In the summer of 1759, a British naval fleet successfully navigates the notoriously treacherous currents of the St. Lawrence River and lays a suffocating siege to Quebec City.
This month-long bombardment culminates in the decisive Battle of the Plains of Abraham. Under the cover of darkness, British forces commanded by General James Wolfe execute a daring amphibious landing.
They scale the steep, heavily wooded cliffs at the Anse au Foulon, completely bypassing the primary French defenses. By daybreak, Montcalm discovers a fully formed British army assembled on the plains directly outside the city walls.
The battle itself was incredibly brief, lasting less than an hour, but it was exceptionally lethal.
Both commanding generals, Wolfe and Montcalm, sustained mortal wounds during the exchange of fire.
The disciplined volleys of the British infantry shattered the French lines, securing the victory. Left without command and facing starvation, the French garrison at Quebec formally surrendered on September 18, 1759.
The British spent the winter consolidating their position, and the following year, multiple British armies converged on Montreal. Recognizing the futility of further resistance, the final French governor-general surrendered the entire colony.
The complex, deeply integrated society that evolved over 2 centuries is effectively dismantled by diplomats sitting at a desk in Europe.
Under the terms of the 1763 Treaty of Paris, the French crown formally cedes the entirety of Canada to Great Britain.
France negotiates to retain only the minuscule rocky islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon off the coast of Newfoundland, preserving them strictly as operational bases to maintain their highly lucrative Atlantic fishing rights.
To avoid surrendering the vast western interior to the British, France transfers the sprawling territory of Louisiana to their ally, Spain, as compensation for Spanish losses during the global conflict.
As an interesting historical footnote to that transfer, the territory of Louisiana would briefly revert to French administrative control decades later under the regime of Napoleon Bonaparte.
However, burdened by European wars, he quickly liquidated the asset, selling the entire territory to the newly formed United States in the 1803 Louisiana Purchase.
It is deeply fascinating how the conclusion of this empire, the conquest of 1759 and 1760, remains one of the most vigorously debated topics in historical circles today.
The sheer polarization of the historiography is remarkable. The exact same historical event is interpreted through entirely contradictory lenses, depending entirely on which historian's analysis you are reading.
That polarization is the defining feature of the historiography, and we must examine how the debate is framed without endorsing a specific interpretation.
Right. So on one side of the academic divide, a traditional school of Anglophone historians has generally portrayed the conquest as a fundamentally progressive event.
They argue that the integration of New France into the robust British imperial system ultimately liberated the population from the stagnation of French absolutism.
In this view, the conquest introduced advanced commercial networks, representative political institutions, and long-term economic stability that benefited the French settlers.
But when you shift to French-Canadian historiography, the analysis shatters into fiercely competing interpretations.
One prominent school of thought views the conquest as an unmitigated, catastrophic rupture.
They argue that the British victory essentially decapitated French-Canadian society, forcing the French commercial and administrative elite to flee back to Europe.
This interpretation suggests the conquest reduced the remaining population to an agrarian underclass, threatening their traditional way of life by exposing them to aggressive British materialism and Protestant assimilation policies.
Conversely, another faction of French-Canadian historians proposes a highly paradoxical interpretation.
They argue that the British conquest, somewhat ironically, served as the ultimate mechanism of cultural preservation.
By severing the colony's ties with France in 1763, the British effectively isolated the French-Canadian population from the violently secular upheavals of the impending French Revolution.
Under the pragmatic, relatively hands-off administration of the early British governors, the French Canadians were able to utilize the legal frameworks to protect their language, solidify the authority of the Catholic Church, and fiercely preserve their traditional customs in a way that might have been impossible had they remained subjects of Paris.
The fact that historians continue to debate whether the fall of the empire was an economic triumph, a cultural tragedy, or a paradoxical saving grace highlights how deeply the events of 1759 continue to inform the modern political identity of North America.
Before we wrap up, I think there is a broader takeaway here about the physical space.
I encourage you to consider a final perspective on this. The political entity known as New France was officially extinguished by the stroke of a pen in 1763. Its flags were lowered, and its administrators were recalled. But observe the modern cartography of the continent.
The French strategic obsession with the interior waterways, you mean?
Exactly. The navigation of the St. Lawrence River, the maritime networks of the Great Lakes, the descent of the Mississippi River, these permanently etched the foundational infrastructure of North America.
The specific placement of major metropolitan centers, the enduring trajectories of continental trade routes.
And the distinct cultural boundaries that stretch from the architecture of Quebec City down to the parishes of New Orleans, all of these realities were explicitly dictated by the early ambitions, the intense struggles, and the logistical decisions of New France.
The political empire collapsed, but its geographical skeleton remains entirely intact. Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.